Chapter 3 09:15 hours, April 12th, 2539. Military calendar. Matrome System, Planet Boundary, outside Salvation Capitol Building. The planet of Boundary was a sprawling and bustling center of commerce known across the Matrome System for its abundance of agricultural foodstuff. Or it was before he had recently found out about the arrival of the genocidal alien conglomeration known as the Covenant. For the last decade, Brigadier General Michael Grant had viewed report after report of decimating attacks across the Orion arm of his galaxy. As the general walked along the boulevard of the planet's capital of salvation, he allowed himself a few minutes to reflect on the progress he made at Boundary. The efforts he had taken to create a robust and fair military presence on the planet over the last 5 years, how he had created a strong rapport with Governor Huxley, and how he had raised a beautiful family after the start of his military career on Reach so many years ago. Now all he could focus on was the masses combing the city streets, blissfully unaware of the horrors that were about to come. 30 minutes ago, the United Earth government appointed official in charge of colonial affairs on the planet of Boundary, Governor Melissa Huxley, had raised him on VidCom to discuss a matter of grave importance. The United Nations Space Command Intelligence Corps had extrapolated from previous engagements in slipspace phenomenon that the Covenant had a near-imminent chance of finding Boundary within just a few days. She had summoned him personally to discuss their options, whether that be evacuation, fighting, or otherwise. Lost in thought, the general continued to meander through the myriad of people strolling down the boulevard next to him. A fair-haired young woman swaddling her baby stood down the road, attempting to calm the upset infant. A man and his family stopped across the street to buy some ice cream, a young boy jumping up and down for joy at the prospect. He reflected once again on his own family, whom he had instructed to start packing. Elaine, his wife of over 20 years, already understood the gravity of his words. She had been with the career officer through everything it felt like. Reach Naval Academy, his first tour to Draco III in 2518, subsequent tours aboard various ships and fleets, and the most traumatic of all, his time as a battalion commander at the planet of Hat Yai. Here he had seen firsthand for the first time the destructive power of the Covenant. Arriving shortly before the Covenant invasion, then Colonel Grant had a relatively plush position, commanding a battalion of some of the finest Marines he had the pleasure of working with. He even had the ever-increasing opportunity to bring his family with him. His post allowed for family members to join in the voyage due to the increasing strain on the inner colonies. The Covenant had been so successful on their attacks to the outer colonies in the first years of the war that planets rich in resources were no longer accessible. This put a significant strain on the inner colonies, forcing many military units to relocate their families for lack of resources. At Hat Yai, jobs were readily available, and a need for planetary security was a must. Little did their superiors know it, however, that in just 5 months into their 4-year tour, their alien invaders were set to arrive. Hat Yai was considered a backwater planet, home to hardy people clinging to life and carving an existence out for themselves. Tropic, humid, and full of things that could kill you, it was the perfect training environment for his Marines. The base was situated in a series of islands, the largest of which were settled in the interior of the cluster. During the initial assault of the planet, Colonel Grant had just a battalion of Marines, along with an undermanned air support squadron provided by the planet's local militia. It was a bloodbath. By the time Vice Admiral Cole's fleet had arrived days later, the Covenant were combing the streets looking for survivors. For whatever reason unknown to him, the aliens seemed to enjoy hunting down and finding any human they could instead of glassing the planet outright. He had instructed his wife to take their 2 children to the basement of their home in the outskirts of the city. As luck would have it, the home had stores of food and fuel for several days. Well under the cover of a dense forest, he was confident that the Covenant would have little interest in his modest homestead. His assumptions proved correct, and for several days his wife, alone with their 2 children, remained in the dark basement. While his wife and 2 children hid, he was reduced to utilizing guerrilla tactics with the remaining 3 companies of Marines under his command. For several days, They waited for help to arrive. He had lost all but one Pelican in the initial blitzkrieg of Covenant forces planetside. In a desperate move, he had decided to keep that bird in reserve for future use. Additional losses included his third company of troops, who were unfortunate enough to be bivouacked only 1 kilometer from the first carrier's drop zone. They didn't even make it out of their racks. For 5 days, while the battle raged over their heads in low orbit, Colonel Grant valiantly directed his Marines scattered throughout the city to attack targets of opportunity, evacuate civilians, and deny the alien invaders critical intelligence and military assets. It wasn't until a mysterious group of equally alien-like troopers and their complement of orbital drop-shock troopers arrived that the tide of the battle turned on the surface. To this day, all requests for information associated with the curious saviors had gone unanswered. After the fresh reinforcements arrived to assist the beleaguered garrison, Colonel Grant shifted his focus from planetary defense to evacuation of any remaining troops and civilians located on the planet. Hour after hour, day after day, he took his remaining Pelican dropship and loaded it with as many families that it could safely handle. Under the cover of darkness, the Pelican's brave pilots rushed each load of precious cargo to the far side of the archipelago where a single UNSC frigate remained groundside. After 9 days, Colonel Grant, his family, and 3 squads of his headquarters company were all that remained in the city, save for the hulking soldiers in their suits of armor and the remains of the ODST battalion that dropped days earlier. As the semi-retired general walked down the street, his attention was drawn to the park situated to his right, just past a line of quaint boutique shops filled with blissfully ignorant denizens. He decided that he would allow himself another moment of respite before the inevitable bad news that was to come. He walked through the gates, high-arched with the words Honey Creek Park laid over them, ornate with the season's first flowers. It reminded him of the lush jungles of Hat Yai before they were scorched to the ground by plasma bombardment. He and his wife would frequent the freshwater tributaries that snaked throughout the island, picking bundles of dazzling colored orchids or lilies. Around him, children played, parents attended to distressed toddlers, and there was even a gentle-looking man peddling ice cream from a bicycle-drawn carriage. General Grant remembered times before this terrible war and wondered if it would ever end. Suddenly, a child ran out in front of him, tears streaming down his face. There was a tinge of fear on his face, as if he had just seen a devil. "Mama! Mama!" the young boy protested, sprinting past the veteran. "It hurts! It hurts!" he screamed. General Grant closed his eyes, placing his palm over his face, and began to rub his temples. He reopened his eyes and began to search for a suitable spot to rest and take a seat for a moment of reflection. "Colonel Grant, it's almost that time," the ODST major said. Nighttime had consumed the city once again, providing an artificial cover of safety for the troopers and their charges. "I know," he replied. "Let me gather my men and their families. I'll meet you at the DZ in 20. He had not slept for what felt like a lifetime. In reality, it had still been in excess of 36 hours since his last semblance of sleep. But he had one final mission to lead. His evacuation efforts were simply too vital to ignore. He could not fail. He would not fail. It was time to muster the deepest dredges of courage and stamina he had left. There were only 18 Marines left with him, including any remaining civilians or family members brave enough to stay behind. He was able to evacuate the remainder of his battalion with the assistance of the ODSTs, but he had one more troop bay's worth of personnel to get to safety. For whatever reason, the Covenant had decided not to glass the colony nor pull their troops from the city. The Marine commander had not questioned their motives, but was glad that their decision left him at least a fighting chance. There was speculation from some of the enlisted that the Covenant were looking for something, searching for things with massive drills and plasma lasers, but it didn't matter. All that mattered now was getting his men and his family off this graveyard. Honey, it's me," he radioed to his wife. He risked one final conversation to confirm her readiness. She and their 2 children had diligently remained in their home's subterranean safe room for several days, making little to no contact with the outside world, communicating only with him. "Michael, are you okay?" The radio crackled to life with the concerned voice of a weary, middle-aged woman. "Yes, dear. It's time. Get the boys ready. Leave everything but the pack on your back. I'll be there to escort you to the pickup zone in 15 minutes. She quickly responded, obviously distracted, and cut the line. She knew that time was of the essence, and there would not be a second chance if they missed their ride. Colonel Grant issued his orders and parted ways with the ODST commander. After a few minutes rounding up their remaining ground vehicles, even including a few civilian transports, they headed to the outskirts of the city under the shroud of darkness blanketing the planet. "Elaine, it's Michael. Come outside, we're nearing the house," he stated briskly over the radio. He was always nervous, raising her over open communications. The Covenant seemed to somehow monitor every frequency at all times. He was only able to speak with her every few days, and only for very briefly. Almost as soon as he keyed the radio, a timid-looking woman and her 2 small children exited the front of the compound. Elaine had rehearsed this maneuver with their 2 young boys several times over the last week, and it seemed that it had paid off. Without hesitation, they threw open the door and began to jog up to the vehicles. Colonel Grant threw open the door of his civilian transport and shouted for them to get in. "Good job, baby. Let's end this nightmare and get the kids out of here," he said breathlessly, happy to see them safe, if only for a moment. "John, Daniel, how are we doing, boys?" He smiled softly as he rekeyed the ignition to the luxury sedan. "Hi, Daddy," the boys responded in unison. A mixed look of joy and exhaustion played across their faces. The next several minutes flew by in quiet anticipation. The convoy of his battalion's 6 remaining vehicles drove in tight formation down the meandering country roads, with only running lights on as to not draw too much attention from any nosy aerial reconnaissance craft in the area. "Sergeant Lee, how is our PZ looking?" The colonel keyed his throat mic while still keeping one hand on the wheel. "Not sure yet, sir," the non-com responded. "I made contact with our bird about 5 minutes ago. They said they were ready to dust off. I just tried hailing them again. We're 3 minutes out. No response." "Acknowledged," he told the sergeant. "All vehicles. This is strong arm actual. Link up and exfil in 3 minutes. Keep your head on a swivel. I want those LA eggs pointed. In the sky with overlapping fields of fire. Sounds like the Covenant is jamming our signal. Expect trouble. Strong arm actual out." As the convoy continued at the safest available speed through the unkept country roads, Colonel Grant began to notice a glowing purple hue wavering through the midnight skyline. At first, it looked like a jellyfish, floating through the inky black night. There were no stars. Not anymore. After 9 days of heavy fighting, black smoke belched from virtually every building in the city, coating the sky in perpetual black tones. After a moment of mesmerized focus on the purple figure, a green orb exploded into his vision and came careening down on the convoy like a sickly-looking meteor. It was too late, as the colonel realized what was happening. He threw a shaky hand toward his throat to key the mic once more as a Banshee attack craft accelerated toward the convoy, preparing a follow-on strafe on the convoy of vehicles. "Aerial attack craft, all vehicles increase speed and maintain 200-meter dispersion," he cried out. "Don't bunch up. We're less than a click out from the objective. Gunners, take them out." His orders didn't need to be said aloud, and he knew it. But for the sake of keeping his unit focused and their minds clear of doubt, he laid out the plan in the cool tone of a comforting parent. "Pelican 17, come in." Sergeant Lee's voice cracked over the convoy's channel. "Pelican 17 receiving." The all-too-familiar voice of Captain Jessup responded with that cool, even tone that every Navy flyer had perfected. "We're ready and waiting. What's the holdup?" Captain Jessup was the sole bird left of the militia's air squadron, choosing to stay behind and offer his services to the colonel. He had managed to engage the Covenant on 3 separate occasions over the course of the siege of Hat Yai and survived. The unwavering, cool voice was betrayed by a twinge of anxiousness, a crack in the otherwise even keel of the pilot. His Pelican, however, betrayed just how much he and his crew had been flirting with danger. Carbon-scored streaks of carnage lined the fuselage and wings. All the Anvil 2 missile pods were gone from the underbelly, and a spiderweb crack in the aft cockpit canopy had become prominent. Another eruption of gunfire from the convoy's Warthog Lag-E cannons went off. A Banshee crashed into the rear vehicle of the column. Plumes of smoke billowed from each as secondary explosions began to ring out from cooked ammunition and plasma discharge. As terrible as the thought was, all Colonel Grant could think was, "It wasn't my wife and children. I need to get them out of here, whatever the cost." "A squadron of Banshee attack craft have engaged our convoy. We are attempting to repel. ETA to your position. 60 seconds. Lee shouted over the deafening howl of the Banshee craft above. They were aptly named, for the haunting whoosh of the flyers above chilled the colonel to his core. "We could use some assistance from that nose gun of yours. It will take us a minute to offload the rest of our personnel before we depart." "Roger that, Strong Arm 3, the pilot replied, spooling up the chin gun, looking for smoke in 60 mics over. While Colonel Grant monitored the radio traffic, he was simultaneously driving and attempting to calm his terrified children. It was a futile gesture, but he tried all the same. The convoy approached a clearing in the dense jungle of Hat Yai's double canopy treetops, the twin engines of Captain Jessup's Pelicans spraying a wash of hot air over the jungle floor below. Once the entire convoy entered the clearing, he exited the vehicle and directed his wife to grab their boys and start heading to the bird. While they moved to be rescued, the colonel would stay back and direct the remaining vehicles of survivors. He reached into a utility pouch on his plate carrier and retrieved a smoke grenade. He hurried away from the beat-up luxury vehicle and into a clearing. The Pelican began its descent as he grasped the grenade in his hand and pulled the pin. At once, a wispy coil of yellow smoke began to billow, and he tossed it away. Careful to direct his attack vehicles in a position to overlap their fields of fire to the rear of the Pelican, he began to supervise the final evacuation. With the Pelican's nose gun pointed to the north and his remaining warthogs emplaced on the southern perimeter surrounding the aerial craft, the colonel was satisfied that they were ready. "Status," he barked at Captain Jessup. He needed to know everyone was on board before he pulled the turret gunners from their post. As soon as they stopped firing, the alien flyers would swoop in for a finishing blow. "This is the crew chief, sir." He heard a response right as the deafening sounds of automatic fire blew through his eardrums once again. "All personnel save you and the gunners accounted for." With the confirmation of all personnel accounted for, he rushed back to the Warthog emplacements, flagging down the gunners to exit the vehicles and double-time it to the Pelican. He sprinted position to position, avoiding a burst of plasma cannon fire before the turret gunner could zero in on the attack run. As he turned to follow the last of the Marines back to the Pelican, he saw in the distance something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A young boy ripped himself from his mother's protective embrace and ran down the ramp of the Pelican. As he started to run toward the colonel, shouting words he would never come to hear, he realized who it was. John, his youngest son, came into focus past the wash of air distorting the view of the escape craft. "No!" he shouted and pumped his body as hard and fast as he had ever in his life. He sprinted to the Pelican and pushed past 2 Marines who were jogging from their vehicles to safety. He saw once again the ominous purple orbs streaking toward him, contrasting an eerie glow as the figures moved from a pinprick to the size of his palm in the night. He couldn't reach his young son in time. As Colonel Grant continued to sprint nearer to the Pelican, he saw a brilliant flash of light preceding a pressure wave of heat and static discharge. He fell to the ground, searing blisters beginning to cover his face and hands. As he lay there, semi-conscious, the 2 Marines previously to his rear bent over, and each took an arm in the crook of their own. His mind went hazy, numb. His tunnel darkened, then funneled to nothingness, only able to focus on the bending and swaying foliage beneath his feet. The trio of Marines struggled up the ramp of the bird and collapsed on the deck. Over the command channel, the crew chief radioed to the pilot to take off, and the Pelican sped away. Where's... He began to murmur, but he couldn't focus. The searing pain covering his body was too intense for a coherent thought. He rolled onto his side, only to see his wife crying, clutching one child. There was something wrong, he knew. He tried his best to focus on a single point. His eyes met the watery gaze of his wife, sobbing and violently heaving her whole body while clutching a single child. His foggy mind stalled as he tried to comprehend what he saw. A grim spike of realization stabbed the forefront of his mind. "Sir, he's gone." One of the Marines who carried him to the Pelican shouted, "Lie down, sir. You caught some of the plasma blast from that Banshee." Overwhelmed with grief and despair, Colonel Grant slipped into unconsciousness, succumbing to a combination of sleep deprivation, exhaustion, and injuries. These were his last moments on Hat Yai, and the last time he had seen combat action. Promptly after the Pelican rendezvoused with the UNSC frigate on the far side of the archipelago, they departed. He was processed for military retirement shortly thereafter. General Grant snapped back to reality, catching himself running weathered hands over scarred and disfigured arms. Although the UNSC had done a great job of grafting new skin to his hands, arms, and part of his legs, he still bore the savage marks from that fateful night. He had lost his son, solidifying his resolve to protect his family and be ready for next time. Now it seemed that it was time to act on that resolution. He rose from his contemplation and worked his way through the park. He smelled the flowers in bloom, listened to the uncorrupted laughter of children, and set his gaze on the end of the block where the UEG government building lay.